A black soldier comes home after a year of service, only to be arrested outside his own house by a cop. No reason, no warning, just thrown in cuffs. But what happens next is nothing short of shocking. In just 5 minutes, he gets the ultimate payback. Stay tuned to see how this all goes down. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was a quiet afternoon when Sergeant Mark Johnson returned to his neighborhood after a long and grueling deployment overseas. He had spent a year serving his country, away from his family, his friends, and the life he had once known. The thought of finally being home was all he could think about as he drove down the familiar street. The trees lining the road seemed to welcome him back, and the house he had left behind, now standing tall in front of him, filled him with relief. Mark had been through so much, and finally being able to step foot on his own porch felt like a victory. He parked his car, grabbed his bag, and headed toward his front door, eager to see his wife and children again. But as he walked toward his house, something felt off. A patrol car was parked across the street, and there was a police officer standing by the curb. Mark didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the officer was just on patrol. But when he got closer, the officer turned his attention toward him. Mark didn't recognize the cop, but he had no reason to be concerned. He was just a soldier coming home after serving his country. But as he reached the steps to his porch, the officer began walking toward him, his gaze fixed on Mark with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "Hey, you. What are you doing here?" the officer called out, his tone sharp and commanding. Mark stopped in his tracks, taken aback by the sudden confrontation. "I live here," Mark replied, trying to stay calm. "I just got back from my deployment. I'm heading inside to see my family." The officer didn't seem to care about Mark's explanation. Instead, his eyes narrowed and he took a step closer. "I need to see some ID," he demanded. Mark felt a wave of confusion. He had just returned from war, and now he was being stopped outside his own home. "Sir, I don't have time for this," Mark said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I'm just trying to get inside." But the officer wasn't backing down. He raised his voice, demanding again, "Show me your ID, now!" Mark, still trying to process what was happening, reached into his pocket to retrieve his identification. But before he could pull it out, the officer moved closer, his hand resting on his holster. Mark froze. Something didn't feel right. Why was this officer so aggressive? Why was he being treated like a criminal when he had just returned from serving in a foreign land? Mark's heart began to race. The officer didn't let up. "I said, step away from the door," he barked. It was then that Mark realized he wasn't going to be allowed to simply go inside. The officer had made up his mind. There was something more to this than just a routine stop. And Mark knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. Something was off about this whole situation. Mark took a deep breath, trying to remain calm despite the growing tension. He looked at the officer, who was now standing right in front of him, a look of authority in his eyes. Mark could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The officer's posture was too aggressive, his tone too harsh. Mark was no stranger to dealing with authority. But this felt different. Personal, even. "Listen," Mark said, trying to defuse the situation. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I've been overseas for a year. I just want to go inside and see my family. I've earned that right." His voice was firm but respectful, hoping to make the officer realize that he wasn't some random stranger causing a disturbance. But instead of easing up, the officer's grip on his radio tightened. "You don't get to tell me what you've earned," the officer shot back. His words were sharp, almost dismissive. Mark's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the officer's tone, the way he spoke, that made Mark's skin crawl. He'd heard about people being treated unfairly by the police, but he never thought it would happen to him. Especially not after everything he had done for the country. He'd served his country with pride, putting his life on the line for people he didn't even know. "Now I need you to step away from the house," the officer ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. Mark's stomach twisted in disbelief. His mind raced. What had he done wrong? This didn't make sense. All he wanted was to go inside, hug his kids, and sleep in his own bed for the first time in months. But the officer wasn't listening to reason. Mark could see the cop's hand hovering over the cuffs, and it hit him like a punch in the gut. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was something more. He was being targeted. Mark's pulse quickened, his mind racing to figure out how to handle the situation. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, things could spiral out of control. He was alone in this moment, facing an officer who seemed determined to make him pay for something he couldn't understand. Mark held up his hands slowly, trying to signal he wasn't going to escalate things further. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm staying here." The officer's eyes flashed with anger. "You want to stay here? Fine, but I'm taking you in," he spat. Without warning, he grabbed Mark's arm and began to pull him toward the squad car. Mark stumbled, trying to resist, but the officer was relentless. "You're under arrest." The words hit Mark like a brick, and his mind reeled with confusion and disbelief. How had everything escalated so fast? As the officer continued to tighten his grip, Mark's thoughts raced. Was this happening because of the uniform he wore? The color of his skin? He tried to keep his calm, but it was hard. His chest tightened with frustration, knowing that this wasn't just an arrest. It was something deeper, something more sinister. Mark struggled against the officer's hold, but the cop's grip only tightened. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists as he was forced toward the patrol car. His mind was racing. What was going on? How had it come to this? This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The officer's eyes were filled with something that Mark couldn't quite place. Was it anger, or something worse? He wasn't sure, but it didn't feel right. "Let go of me!" Mark shouted, his voice rising in frustration. The officer didn't respond, his eyes cold and unwavering. Mark could feel the heat rising in his chest. He was a soldier. He had faced battles far more dangerous than this. But none of them had prepared him for this kind of fight. A fight for his dignity, for his very identity. The officer didn't care about his service, didn't care that he had just come home to his family. To him, Mark was just another black man on the street, someone to be controlled, someone to be put in their place. As they neared the squad car, Mark knew that things were getting worse by the second. The officer hadn't even bothered to explain why he was being arrested, or if he even had a legitimate reason to detain him. All he knew was that this man, this officer, had already decided Mark was guilty of something. But guilty of what? Being a black man in uniform? Coming home from war? The thought gnawed at Mark as he struggled to stay calm, to keep his head in the game. "Stop resisting," the officer barked, pulling Mark's arm harshly behind his back. Mark's vision blurred with anger, but he knew better than to let it control him. He had learned discipline and control in the military. He couldn't afford to lose that now. He needed to think, to act with clarity. He had to figure out how to get out of this situation without it escalating further. With a deep breath, Mark spoke slowly but with force. "You're making a huge mistake. I've done nothing wrong. If you don't release me right now, you're going to regret it." The officer paused for a moment, and for a split second, Mark saw something flicker in the cop's eyes. Maybe doubt, maybe realization. But it was gone just as quickly as it came. The officer shoved him forward with more force, his voice cold and commanding. "Shut up. I said you're under arrest. Don't make it worse." Mark's heart sank. There was no reasoning with this man. No matter what he said, no matter how calmly he explained the situation, the officer wasn't listening. This wasn't about justice. It was about power, control, and Mark being at the wrong place at the wrong time. But something inside Mark refused to back down. He wasn't going to let this man, this stranger, define who he was. Not after everything he'd been through. He had fought for his country, for the right to walk freely without fear, to return home to his family without facing this kind of injustice. He wasn't about to let a racist cop take that from him. With a steady breath, Mark finally spoke again, his voice quiet but determined. "You're making a mistake, but I'll handle it. You'll see." The officer sneered at him as if Mark was just some fool talking big. But Mark knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the officer began to push Mark into the back seat of the squad car, a knot tightened in his stomach. The door slammed shut behind him, and the cold, sterile interior of the vehicle felt like a prison. Mark sat there, his mind racing. Every fiber of his being wanted to explode with anger, but he knew he couldn't let that happen. He needed to keep his cool. He was a soldier. He had been trained to handle pressure, to think strategically, no matter the situation. Through the tinted windows of the car, Mark could see the officer standing by the curb, watching him closely. It was as though he expected Mark to make a move, any move, that would give him an excuse to escalate things further. Mark didn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, he focused on his breathing, trying to clear his mind. He thought about his family, his wife, his kids, the warm, welcoming home he had longed to return to. They were waiting for him, and now, here he was, trapped in the back of a police car, with no clear reason for why he was being detained. He had served his country with honor, yet somehow none of that seemed to matter. None of it mattered to this officer who had decided, for reasons Mark couldn't understand, that he didn't belong here. Mark's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, and something caught his attention. The officer standing next to the squad car was speaking into his radio. It was clear that he was calling for backup. Mark knew that if he stayed here too long, things could get much worse. This wasn't just about an arrest anymore. It was about power, control, and the officer's desire to make an example out of him. But then, something shifted in Mark. He remembered something he had learned long ago during his training. A soldier never fights with emotion. He fights with intelligence, and right now, he needed to think. He needed to stay one step ahead. He couldn't afford to let this situation spiral out of control. Mark took a deep breath and reached for his phone, which he had managed to keep in his pocket when the officer first approached him. He wasn't sure if it would make a difference, but he knew it was worth a shot. With his hand still cuffed behind his back, he used his thumb to unlock the phone and dialed his attorney's number. He had been through enough military operations to understand the importance of having a plan. And in this moment, his plan was simple. Make the call, and make sure someone knew what was happening. As the phone rang, Mark's mind replayed the officer's actions, his harsh words, the way he had dismissed Mark's service, the way he had treated him like a criminal for no reason. It wasn't right. But if there was one thing Mark had learned in the military, it was that sometimes you had to fight on your terms, not your enemies. The phone rang several more times before the voice on the other end finally picked up. "This is Tom Carter. How can I help you?" the voice asked, calm but professional. "Tom," Mark said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency, "I need you to listen carefully. I'm being arrested by a cop outside my house. No explanation, no reason. I've just come back from a deployment and this guy is treating me like I'm a criminal. I need you to get here fast. This is bad." The lawyer's voice was calm, but Mark could hear the concern. "All right, Mark. Stay where you are. I'll make some calls. Don't do anything that could escalate the situation. Just hang tight, okay? Help is on the way." Mark hung up the phone and took another deep breath. He had done all he could for now. He had a plan in place, and now he just had to wait. But waiting was the hardest part. Mark wasn't a man who liked to be passive. He wasn't a man who liked to sit by while someone else took control of his life. But in this moment, he knew the best course of action was to remain composed. As the officer continued to stand by his patrol car, Mark's thoughts turned to what might happen next. Would the officer listen to reason when his lawyer showed up? Or would he dig in deeper, refusing to back down? Mark didn't know. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this man get away with it. Minutes passed, but to Mark, they felt like hours. Every second in that cramped back seat added to the mounting frustration, and he could feel the tension in his muscles as he shifted uncomfortably. He tried to focus on the small details around him, the faint sound of cars passing by, the distant hum of the city, the steady tapping of his foot against the car's floor, but it did little to ease the storm brewing inside him. His mind kept returning to the same question. Why? Why had this officer decided to target him? Was it because of his uniform, his skin color? Or was it just a case of pure, unprovoked hostility? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of another car pulling up. Mark's eyes darted toward the rearview mirror again. Another squad car. Backup. He had a sinking feeling in his gut. This wasn't good. It was like the officer was preparing to escalate things even further. The door to the squad car creaked open, and Mark saw two more officers approach, their faces set in grim expressions. One of the officers, a tall man with a buzz cut, glanced at Mark, then at the original officer who had arrested him. Without saying a word, he nodded as though acknowledging something unsaid. The officer who had detained Mark started talking quickly, explaining the situation. Although Mark could tell from his tone that he wasn't exactly being honest about the details. The new officers stood silently, watching the scene unfold. Mark tried to get a read on them, but their faces were unreadable. He could hear snippets of their conversation, but nothing made sense. It was as though they were treating him like some kind of threat without knowing anything about him. Mark, still cuffed and stuck in the back seat of the patrol car, fought the urge to scream. His phone buzzed in his pocket. His lawyer, Tom Carter, had texted him, "Hang in there, I'm on my way." It was the only thing that gave him a sliver of hope, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone in this. But it wasn't going to be easy. He could feel it in the air. Things were about to get a lot more intense. The officer who had arrested him stepped up to the squad car, his face hard, almost defiant. "You're lucky you're not facing more charges," he said coldly, looking through the bars of the window at Mark. "I could have made this worse, but I'm giving you a chance to settle down." Mark's jaw tightened. "You've already made it worse. I haven't done anything wrong." His voice was steady, but underneath it, there was an unmistakable edge. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, sizing him up, trying to figure out what to do next. Mark knew he had to stay calm, but it was getting harder to keep his emotions in check. The officer didn't respond right away, but he didn't have to. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let this officer walk away from this without facing some kind of consequence. The thought of being wrongfully arrested, treated like a criminal when all he had done was return home to his family, gnawed at him. But he also knew something else. His lawyer was on the way. He had made the call, and now, the legal support he needed was coming to make sure this injustice didn't go unnoticed. If the officer was hoping to get away with this, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Mark leaned back in the seat, trying to stay composed. The officer was still standing there, glaring at him through the bars. Mark could feel the weight of his gaze, but he refused to let it rattle him. He had been through worse. This officer might have all the power right now, but it wouldn't last. There were consequences for actions like this, and Mark was ready to make sure that the officer would face them. The officer stood there for a few more moments, staring at Mark as if he were waiting for him to back down or say something that would give him an excuse to escalate the situation even further. But Mark didn't flinch. His body was tense, his muscles sore from the restraints, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't going to let this man treat him like he was beneath him, like his life didn't matter. Finally, the officer turned to walk back to his car, exchanging a few words with the two backup officers. Mark couldn't hear the conversation, but he could tell from their body language that they weren't exactly agreeing with each other. One officer kept glancing over at Mark, a look of confusion on his face, as though he wasn't entirely sure why they were even detaining him in the first place. The other officer, however, was just following orders, his eyes cold and distant. Mark's stomach tightened. He had been here for what felt like forever, yet no one had bothered to explain why he was being arrested. No one had given him any answers. His thoughts went back to his family. They were waiting for him. His wife, his kids, they had no idea what was going on. They probably thought he was home, safe. He could only imagine the panic they'd feel if they knew what was happening. The sound of another car approaching broke Mark's thoughts. He turned his head to see a sleek black sedan pull up to the curb. His lawyer, Tom Carter. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The feeling of relief was immediate, but it wasn't enough to fully erase the knot in his stomach. There was still the matter of the officer, still the threat of things spiraling out of control. But at least now, there was someone who knew what was happening. Tom stepped out of the car and immediately walked toward the officers with purpose. Mark could see the lawyer's confident stride as he moved past the backup officers, who made no effort to stop him. He was a man who had done this before, who knew exactly how to handle situations like this. "Excuse me, officers," Tom said, his voice firm but respectful. He wasn't shouting, wasn't demanding attention. But there was an undeniable authority in his tone. The officers turned toward him, their faces still hard, but there was an uncertainty now that hadn't been there before. They weren't expecting this. They weren't expecting someone who knew the law and wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. Mark could see Tom show his ID to the officers, then glance over toward him, offering a brief nod of reassurance. It was a small gesture, but it made all the difference. Mark felt the tension in his body ease just a little. "What's going on here, officer?" Tom asked, his voice calm but probing. The officer who had arrested Mark, clearly caught off guard by the presence of a lawyer, paused before answering. "This man is under arrest for resisting arrest," the officer said. But there was a hesitation in his voice. He didn't sound as certain as before. Tom raised an eyebrow, not buying it. Resisting arrest? Really? Because from what I'm hearing, this man was standing on his own property after returning from a year-long deployment when he was accosted without cause. His words were measured, but there was no mistaking the authority behind them. The officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes flicking nervously between Tom and the other officers. The two backup cops exchanged glances, one of them looking like he might want to speak up but was unsure. Mark could feel the shift in the air. The tension was starting to unravel. They weren't expecting this level of scrutiny. "Look," Tom continued, "I don't know what your issue with my client is, but I do know that if this goes any further, you're going to have to explain why an active duty soldier was treated this way on his own property, with no probable cause." His voice was calm but carried the weight of someone who wasn't afraid to stand his ground. The officer who had arrested Mark shifted uncomfortably, his expression faltering. He hadn't been prepared for someone who knew the law, who was ready to call him out on his actions. Mark could sense that the officer was beginning to realize that he might have made a mistake. "I'm going to need to see your supervisor," Tom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was a move that caught the officer off guard. Without waiting for an answer, Tom turned and began walking toward the nearest police vehicle, pulling out his phone as he did so. Mark's heart began to beat a little faster. He could feel that something was about to change. The officers stood there, momentarily stunned by Tom's calm and confident handling of the situation. Mark had no doubt that the presence of his lawyer had turned the tables. The cop was no longer the one in control. He was now the one being scrutinized, and the power dynamic had shifted. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the arrest began, Mark felt like there was a way out. The officer who had originally detained Mark was visibly rattled now. He stood by his patrol car, fumbling with his radio as if hoping to get some sort of backup or guidance from higher up. The other officers looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances as they waited for their supervisor to arrive. Mark could see it in their faces. They were starting to realize that they might have made a serious mistake. The calm confidence that Tom had brought with him had turned the tables completely, and now it was clear that the officers were on the defensive. Mark stayed in the back seat of the squad car, still handcuffed, but for the first time, he felt a slight sense of relief. The oppressive weight of the situation wasn't completely gone, but it was starting to lift. The arrival of his lawyer had shifted the dynamic. No longer was he just a man being bullied by a racist officer. Now he had someone on his side, someone who understood the law and wasn't afraid to challenge authority. Minutes passed, though they felt like an eternity. The sound of a car approaching broke the silence. It wasn't just any car. It was a marked police vehicle, the supervisor. The officer who had been running things, the one in charge of this whole mess, pulled up and stepped out of his car with an air of authority. He was taller than the others, wearing a stern expression, clearly used to being in charge. Without waiting for the supervisor to approach, Tom immediately began speaking to him, walking over with purpose. "Officer, we have a situation here that needs to be addressed," he said, his tone firm but respectful. The supervisor looked briefly at Mark in the car, then at Tom, but instead of immediately responding, he turned to his officers. The original officer who had arrested Mark stood to the side, not quite making eye contact with his supervisor. He looked almost like a child caught in the act, unsure of how to defend his actions. Tom wasted no time. "I've already explained the situation to your officers here. My client, Sergeant Mark Johnson, has just returned home from deployment. He was approached by your officer outside his own property and arrested without cause." The supervisor glanced at the officer who had detained Mark. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice cool but sharp. The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. We had reason to question him. He was acting suspicious." The officer's voice faltered, and Mark could see his face turning red as he spoke. It was clear that his story wasn't adding up, and the supervisor wasn't buying it. "Suspicious?" Tom repeated, his voice low and laced with disbelief. "Is that really your explanation? For arresting a man on his own property? For no reason other than his appearance?" The supervisor's expression darkened. He looked over at Mark in the squad car and then back at the officer, clearly frustrated. The other officers stood quietly, awaiting the supervisor's decision. "You should have known better," the supervisor finally said, his voice low and filled with disappointment. "If there was no probable cause for arrest, you should have never detained him. I'll have to report this." Mark felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone was taking his side. Finally, someone was seeing the truth in the situation. The supervisor turned toward Tom, his demeanor shifting from annoyance to a more professional tone. "We'll take it from here," the supervisor said, directing the officer to release Mark from the handcuffs. The officer, still visibly uncomfortable, fumbled with the cuffs, undoing them quickly and stepping back. Mark rubbed his wrists, the sting of the metal still fresh, but he didn't care. He was free again. As the door to the squad car opened, Mark stepped out slowly, still feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. He wasn't quite sure if it was over yet, but he was no longer being treated like a criminal. The supervisor gave him a brief, apologetic nod, though it felt hollow. Nothing could erase the feeling of being wrongfully arrested, of being made to feel less than human. But at least now, Mark knew that this officer's actions wouldn't go unchallenged. Tom stood beside him, his posture relaxed but confident. "You're free to go," the supervisor said, as though he was doing Mark some kind of favor. Mark nodded, though the bitterness of the whole situation still lingered. "Thank you," Mark said to Tom, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Tom gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't thank me just yet. We're not done here, but you'll get the justice you deserve. This isn't over for that officer, and it won't be for you either." Mark nodded, feeling the anger that had been building up inside him start to fade. It wasn't over yet, but things were finally starting to go in the right direction. The wrongs would be righted, and justice would prevail. But more than that, Mark knew he had won the most important battle of all. He had refused to be silenced, to be treated as less than. And that, more than anything, made him feel like a victor. As Mark stepped away from the squad car, still absorbing the weight of what had just happened, he glanced at the officer who had arrested him. The man was standing a few feet away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. There was no pride in his posture now, no authority in his stance. It was clear that, for all his bluster, the officer had been caught in a lie, and Mark wasn't the one who had to pay for it. The supervisor walked over to the officer, speaking in a low voice, but Mark could hear the disappointment in his tone. "We don't handle things like this. Not in this department," he said. "You'll be hearing from internal affairs." Mark didn't care to hear any more. His mind was still reeling from everything that had just transpired. He had been so sure, so certain that the officer would have his way, that this would turn into something worse, something that couldn't be undone. But now, standing here, he realized that the fight wasn't over. Not for him. Not for anyone who faced injustice in silence. Tom had made sure of that. "Let's go," Tom said, placing a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder, snapping him out of his thoughts. "I'll make sure this never happens again." As they walked toward the car, Mark took one last look at the officers. The one who had arrested him still stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking completely deflated. Mark knew the reality of the situation. This wasn't just a case of one cop acting on his own. It was a symptom of something much deeper. A culture that allowed these kinds of actions to go unchecked. A system that made people like Mark feel less than human simply because of the color of their skin. But today, something had changed. Tom led Mark to his car, and as they both got inside, Mark's phone buzzed again. It was a message from his wife. "Where are you? We're waiting for you." Mark's heart sank at the thought of what his wife had probably gone through. She had no idea what had just happened. He quickly typed out a reply. "I'm on my way." "I'm okay." As the car rolled down the street, Tom glanced at him. "You'll get your day in court. This isn't just about the arrest, Mark. We're going to hold that officer accountable. He crossed a line." Mark nodded. It felt surreal, like a weight had been lifted off his chest. The anger that had been simmering inside him was now replaced by a quiet sense of satisfaction. There was still a long road ahead. He knew that. He knew this would take time. But today, he had stood his ground. Today he had made sure that what happened to him wouldn't go unnoticed. They pulled into Mark's driveway, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Mark saw the familiar outline of his house. His children's laughter echoed from the backyard, and he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. His family was here. They were waiting for him. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, taking a deep breath. As he turned the handle and stepped inside, his wife's eyes met his, full of worry. But when she saw him standing there unharmed, her expression softened, and she rushed to his side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky with concern. "I'm fine," Mark said, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm home." But even as he held her, the weight of the day still lingered. He knew that there was more to do, more fights to be fought. He had made it through today, but that didn't mean the struggle was over. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, who had ever felt the sting of injustice. As he kissed his wife and gathered his kids around him, Mark felt a quiet fire burn inside him. The ultimate payback wasn't just about what he had gone through. It was about the change that would come from his standing up, from his refusal to be intimidated, from his decision to not stay silent. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but it was a road he was ready to walk, and he would walk it with his head held high. The warmth of his family's embrace was a comfort. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that everything that had happened that afternoon wasn't as easily forgotten as it seemed. Yes, he was home now, physically safe with his wife and kids. But the emotional toll of what he had just gone through hung heavy in the air. He looked at his children, their innocent faces lighting up when they saw him. But a nagging question kept circling in his mind. What if things had gone differently? What if the officer hadn't backed down? What if Tom hadn't shown up? What if he hadn't kept his cool? The reality of the situation set in as Mark sat down at the kitchen table, his kids chattering excitedly around him. He tried to focus on their stories, the small details of their day, but his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation outside his house. He had been treated like a criminal without reason, as if his years of service, his loyalty to the country, and his role as a father and husband meant nothing. All because of his skin color. It burned him deep inside, that realization, that no matter how much he had done, there were still people who saw him only for his race and not for who he truly was. His wife, Sarah, noticed the distant look in his eyes. She paused in the middle of helping their youngest with a plate of food and sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft yet understanding. She had known him long enough to recognize when his mind was elsewhere, even when he tried to hide it. Mark nodded, letting out a long sigh. I can't help it, Sarah. The whole thing just doesn't sit right with me. How easy it was for that officer to treat me like I was less than him, like I wasn't even human. His voice caught for a moment, the frustration and hurt creeping into his words. I've served this country, I've fought for this country, and yet, to him, I was just another black man he could push around. Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with sympathy. She understood the weight of what he was feeling. She had witnessed it before, in small ways and large. The subtle stares, the unfair treatment, the everyday microaggressions that came with being a black man in a world that often didn't value you the same as others. It was something they both knew all too well, but hearing it from Mark, hearing the pain in his voice, made it hit even harder. I'm proud of you, Mark, she said quietly. You didn't back down. You stood up for yourself and for everyone who has ever been in your shoes. That officer can't take that away from you. Mark smiled faintly, grateful for her support. He knew she was right. He had stood his ground, and he had done it for the right reasons. But it still wasn't enough to erase the sting of the injustice, or the lingering fear that this might not be the last time he'd face something like this. It was like a shadow that followed him, one that he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. I don't know if I'm ready for this fight, Sarah, Mark admitted, his voice low. It's exhausting. I just want to live my life, to come home to you and the kids, to be at peace. But this thing, it just keeps following me. It's not over. I know it's not over. Sarah leaned in, her forehead resting against his, as if trying to ground him, trying to remind him that they were in this together. You don't have to fight it alone. You've got me. You've got us. And you've got people who are listening now. People who are willing to help you make sure that officer answers for what he did. Mark's heart tightened. He knew she was right. There was a legal battle ahead, but he wasn't in it alone. He had Tom, his lawyer, who had already shown he was ready to go the distance, and he had the support of his family, his community, people who would stand with him. But even as he felt comforted by this, he knew the fight wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about the officer who had wrongfully detained him. It was about the larger system that allowed these kinds of things to happen in the first place. Do you think it'll change anything? Mark asked quietly, still lost in thought. Do you think we can make a difference? Sarah was silent for a moment, thinking carefully before she spoke. I think it has to start somewhere. Maybe it won't change everything overnight, but one step at a time, we can make people see what's really going on. We can make people listen, and we can make sure that this doesn't happen again to someone else. Mark took in her words, nodding slowly. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that his fight would mean something, that it could spark a larger change. But the cynic in him wondered if it was all just a dream. How many others had faced the same thing and still felt like nothing had changed? But then he thought of the officer, the way his face had faltered when Tom showed up. He had been caught. He had been forced to answer for his actions. That wasn't something that happened every day, and Mark had been the one to make it happen. Maybe this wasn't about changing the whole world in one day. Maybe it was about standing up when no one else would. Maybe it was about sending a message, a loud, undeniable message that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. As the evening wore on, and Mark tucked his children into bed, kissed his wife goodnight, and settled into the quiet of their home, a sense of peace began to settle in. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but tonight, he could rest. Tonight, he had won. And tomorrow, when the battle continued, he would face it with strength and resolve. The officer's mistake had been his biggest miscalculation. He had underestimated Mark Johnson, and that was something he would regret for a long time to come. Mark had just made sure that the next person who faced the same injustice wouldn't have to face it alone. He wouldn't let them. And that, Mark realized, was the ultimate payback. The night passed in a quiet blur. Mark barely slept, his mind racing between moments of rest and flashes of what had transpired earlier that day. He kept replaying the arrest in his mind, the officer's words, the coldness in his eyes, and the feeling of helplessness as he was handcuffed outside his own home. Each time he thought about it, it felt like a knot tightening in his chest. But there was something else there too. Something that had started to grow since Tom had arrived. The unmistakable feeling that for the first time in a long time he wasn't powerless. He woke up the next morning to the sound of his kids running through the house, their laughter filling the air. It was the same sound he'd missed while he was deployed. The noise of his life, his world, carrying on without him. As he lay there in bed, he could feel the weight of everything still hanging over him. But today it felt different. The anger, the fear, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it wasn't consuming him anymore. There was a sense of resolve now, a quiet certainty that he wasn't just a victim in this situation. He was part of the solution. After a quick breakfast, Mark decided to take a walk outside to clear his head. He stepped out onto the front porch, the cool morning air brushing against his face. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Birds were singing, cars driving by in the distance. It felt like the calm before the storm. He knew it wouldn't stay this quiet for long. The legal battle ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he wasn't dreading it. He was ready for it. As he walked down the driveway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Tom. "I've got the ball rolling with internal affairs. I'll keep you posted on any updates. But Mark, this is just the beginning." Mark nodded to himself, reading the message again. He had known it wouldn't end with just one conversation. He had known that Tom would push harder, demand answers, and make sure the officer's actions were accounted for. But as Mark stood there in his front yard, he realized that this wasn't just about the officer anymore. This wasn't just about one bad cop and one bad day. This was about a much larger issue, something that affected every black man, every person of color, who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. This was about a fight that, in many ways, Mark had been a part of his entire life. Only now it felt personal. He thought about the many conversations he'd had with his friends, his fellow soldiers, about race and injustice. It was something they all talked about in hushed tones, something that lingered in the background of every conversation. It was as if everyone knew it was there, but no one knew what to do about it. No one ever talked about the deep underlying fears that came with being a black man in America. The fear of being pulled over, the fear of being falsely accused, the fear of not making it home at the end of the day. He had seen it all too often. His friends, his brothers in arms, all trying to navigate a system that didn't always have their backs. And now it had happened to him. But this time Mark wasn't going to let it slip away. This time he was going to make sure people understood just how deep the problem ran, how this wasn't just an isolated incident, but a part of a much bigger picture. Mark took another deep breath, the weight of his thoughts grounding him as he stood outside, staring at the street. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his kids, for their future, for the future of every young black man and woman who might one day face the same thing. He knew the fight would be exhausting. He knew there would be days when it seemed like nothing would change. But he also knew this. If no one else stood up, if no one else was willing to speak out, then nothing would ever get better. He heard the sound of his wife's voice calling out from the doorway. "Mark, are you coming inside? The kids are asking when you'll be back." Mark smiled, feeling a flicker of warmth in his chest. The kids were the reason he had to keep going, the reason he had to make sure this fight counted for something. He walked back toward the house, his steps slow but purposeful. "I'll be right there," he called back. "Just needed some air." As he re-entered the house, he was greeted with the usual chaos of family life. His kids bickering over toys, Sarah making breakfast, the hum of normalcy that he had missed so much. For a brief moment, he let himself forget about the world outside, the world that had treated him unfairly, the world that was still broken in so many ways. He let himself be present, let himself be part of this moment, this family, this life he had fought for. But as the day wore on, the reality of what had happened, and what still needed to happen, came crashing back. He knew he couldn't forget, not yet. But at least now, he knew he wasn't alone. He had people in his corner, people who would help him navigate the long road ahead. That afternoon, Mark sat down with Sarah, going over the details of what had happened the day before. They discussed the legal steps Tom was taking, and Mark felt the weight of the situation sink in once again. This wasn't just about making sure one officer paid for his actions. It was about making a statement, about holding the system accountable. It was about proving that this kind of treatment wouldn't be tolerated anymore. "We're going to do this the right way," Mark said, his voice firm, his resolve solid. "I'm not letting this go. We're going to make sure that officers held accountable. And maybe, just maybe, we'll make a difference." Sarah nodded, her hand in his. "We will. I believe in you." Mark gave a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. They were in it together. And that made all the difference. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and quiet moments of reflection. Mark had been caught off guard by how quickly things began to unfold after Tom got involved. Within 24 hours, Mark's case had become more than just a wrongful arrest. It was a catalyst. News of the incident started circulating within their community, and before long, word spread to local news outlets. Tom had done his part in getting the right people involved, and now Mark was more than just a soldier wrongfully detained. He was a symbol of a much larger issue that needed to be addressed. Mark couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions as the calls continued to pour in. There was relief, of course. Tom had already secured a meeting with Internal Affairs, and the officer who had arrested Mark was being investigated for misconduct. But with that relief came something else, something he hadn't fully anticipated. Public attention. People were reaching out to him from all over, offering support, sharing their own stories, expressing anger over what had happened, and asking how they could help. It was overwhelming, to say the least. Mark had never wanted to be a public figure. He wasn't some activist or leader. He was just a man trying to get home to his family. But now, it felt like his personal fight was about to become something much bigger. The pressure started to build as the days passed. Mark hadn't fully prepared himself for the weight of being in the spotlight. When the local news ran a segment on his story, the outpouring of support and the criticism came fast. There were people who praised him for standing up, for not backing down, but there were also voices questioning why he hadn't complied immediately with the officer's orders. The familiar tired rhetoric echoed through social media comments and talk show debates. It was a reminder of just how far we still had to go. Some people didn't want to understand. They only wanted to see things in black and white, ignoring the context, the history, and the reality of what it meant to be a black man in America. Mark tried to avoid reading the comments. He knew they were only going to fuel the anger that was already simmering inside him. But it wasn't always easy to look away. Some of the messages cut deep. They questioned his motives, his actions, as if his mere presence on that street had been a provocation. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like a never-ending cycle. People questioning his right to exist, to walk freely in his own neighborhood without fear of being judged, of being stopped, of being treated like a suspect. But there were also messages of support. People thanked him for speaking out, for putting a face to the issue of racial injustice that many preferred to ignore. There were parents reaching out to him, sharing stories about how they taught their children to be careful around the police, how they prayed every day that their sons would make it home safe. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for them, for everyone who had ever been forced to live with the constant fear that their skin color might be enough to make them a target. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Mark sat down with Sarah, exhausted. They hadn't had much time to talk in the midst of all the chaos, and Mark knew he needed to process everything with her. She had been his rock through all of this, supporting him every step of the way. But Mark could see the toll it was taking on her, too. The long hours, the phone calls, the attention. It was starting to feel like they were both being pulled in too many directions. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," Mark admitted, his voice quiet, as he leaned back on the couch. "It's like I can't escape it. The phone's always ringing, there's always someone wanting to talk, wanting a statement. And half of them don't even care about the real story. They just want the drama, the controversy." Sarah sat down beside him, her eyes filled with concern. "I know it's hard. It's been overwhelming for both of us. But you've already made a difference, Mark. Just by standing up, just by sharing your story, you've already started something. You've given people the courage to speak out, to stand up for themselves too." Mark sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that his actions had already had an impact. But some days, it was hard to feel like anything would truly change. The system felt so ingrained, so powerful, that it seemed impossible to break free from it. The officer who had arrested him was still out there, still on the job, and Mark couldn't help but wonder if he was the only one who was going to pay for what had happened. Sarah reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're not alone in this, Mark. This is bigger than one person. It's bigger than that officer. You're a part of something that's changing, and you've got a whole community behind you now." For a moment, Mark just looked at her, letting her words sink in. She was right. There were people behind him, people who had reached out, people who were demanding change. He didn't have to carry this burden alone, and maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point. Maybe his story would lead to real change. The next day, Tom called with an update. Internal Affairs had begun their investigation into the officer's actions, and they had already spoken to several witnesses who had seen what happened that day. It was becoming clear that the officer had overstepped his bounds, and the evidence was stacking up against him. But it wasn't over yet. Tom explained that there would be a hearing in the coming weeks, where Mark would have to give his account of the events in front of a panel. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew this would be the real test. The truth would be laid bare, and there was no going back. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was walking into that room alone. His lawyer, his family, the community, they were all standing behind him. And that, he realized, was what gave him strength. This fight wasn't just about justice for him. It was about justice for everyone who had ever been wrongly accused, wrongly arrested, or mistreated by those in power. It was about making sure that the next person who found themselves in his shoes wouldn't have to face it alone. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for the road ahead. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But now, more than ever, he was ready for it. And no matter how hard the fight got, no matter how much resistance they encountered, he would keep going. For himself, for his family, and for everyone who had been forced to endure this kind of injustice for far too long. The following weeks moved quickly, as though the world was rushing ahead while Mark stood at the center, trying to steady himself in the whirlwind. The investigation into the officer's actions continued, but the pressure on Mark intensified. There were public rallies, press conferences, and constant media coverage of his story. It was surreal, like watching his life unfold on a screen. Only it was real, and he was at the center of it. Mark had never imagined himself as a figurehead in the fight for justice. He was just a soldier, a husband, and a father. But now, with the world watching, it felt like the weight of every word, every action was magnified. He couldn't escape the constant questions, the scrutinizing eyes of strangers. And though the support from his community and beyond was overwhelming, it was still hard to shake the anxiety that came with being in the spotlight. The pressure was constant, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, and it seemed like every day brought a new challenge, a new hurdle to overcome. But even as the stress built, there was one thing Mark could always count on: his family. They were the anchor in the storm, the reminder of why he was doing this, why he couldn't back down. Sarah, always by his side, never once faltered in her support. She had always known Mark was a man of principle, a man who wouldn't stay silent when things weren't right. But seeing him step into the public eye like this, it was different. She saw the toll it was taking, and yet she never wavered. Every night after the cameras were off, after the reporters had left, it was her comforting words, her embrace, that helped him recharge. She was his reminder of what really mattered. And then there were his children. They were too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, but they were old enough to see the difference in their father. They could sense the change in the air. Mark was a different man than he had been before that day outside his home. He wasn't just their dad anymore. He was a man who was standing up, speaking out, and making sure that no one, no matter their background or color, would have to face the same kind of injustice he had. One evening, as the sun set and Mark sat on the porch, his mind drifting as he watched his kids play in the yard, he received a call from Tom. His heart skipped a beat as he answered, knowing this could be the update they had been waiting for. "Mark," Tom began, his voice steady but with an edge of something that Mark couldn't place. "I just got off the phone with Internal Affairs. They've concluded their investigation. The officer is facing serious charges. They've found sufficient evidence that he acted improperly and violated department protocol." Mark's breath caught in his throat. For a moment it didn't feel real. The news, though expected, was still a shock. "So what happens now?" Mark asked, trying to mask the emotion that was creeping into his voice. "Now, there will be a hearing. The department will move forward with disciplinary actions, and the officer will have to answer for his behavior. But the investigation isn't over yet. There's still the potential for criminal charges depending on the findings of a further review. This is a step in the right direction, but we're not done." Mark nodded slowly, his mind whirling with the weight of it all. He had spent so many sleepless nights thinking about this moment, but now that it was here, it felt both satisfying and deeply unsettling. Yes, the officer was being held accountable, but there was still so much more to be done. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about the larger issue of police accountability, of systemic racism, and of the communities that had been forced to live under the constant threat of mistreatment for generations. The fight was just beginning. "Thank you, Tom," Mark said quietly. "We've made it this far. We just need to keep pushing, right?" "That's right," Tom replied. "You've done the hard part, Mark. You stood up when others wouldn't, and now we have a chance to make sure this doesn't happen again." Mark hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, looking at the horizon, the last slivers of sunlight disappearing behind the trees. He could hear his children's laughter in the background, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the weight he was carrying. His thoughts shifted back to the officer, the man who had tried to break him, to make him feel small. But now it was clear. This wasn't about the officer anymore. It was about something bigger, something more profound. Sarah came outside and sat next to him, noticing the pensive look on his face. She didn't ask what the call was about. She didn't need to. She could read him like a book. "It's a step forward," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not sure it's enough. There's still so much to fix." She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know, but this is just the beginning, Mark. You've started something, and when the dust settles, we'll look back and see that you made a difference. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been treated the way you were." Mark smiled faintly, though there was still a part of him that wasn't sure if things could really change. He had seen too much, experienced too much, to believe that a single case, even one as high profile as his, could change the entire system. But there was something in Sarah's words that made him hold on to hope. Maybe it wasn't about changing everything at once. Maybe it was about creating ripples. Each action, each word, each moment of resistance would send out waves that couldn't be undone. And even if it took years, even if it took decades, maybe the world would one day be different for his children, for the next generation. "Do you think it'll ever be enough?" Mark asked, his voice soft, vulnerable in a way that he hadn't allowed himself to be before. Sarah looked at him, her hand in his, and smiled. "It will be enough when we look back and know we did everything we could, and when our kids grow up and know that their dad fought for a better world. That's enough for me." The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that came from years of being together, weathering storms and fighting battles side by side. Mark squeezed her hand, feeling a strength he hadn't known he had. This fight wasn't over, but now, more than ever, he felt like he was on the right path. As the evening light faded into twilight, Mark looked out at his children playing in the yard, laughing, unaware of the weight their father was carrying. He was determined to keep that laughter alive, to protect their innocence and to make sure that the world they grew up in was just a little bit safer, a little bit fairer than the one he had inherited. It wouldn't be easy. But Mark was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the hearing felt like a lifetime to Mark. Every day seemed to bring new developments, new twists in a story that was far from over. The media coverage didn't stop. News outlets, both local and national, continued to follow his case. His name was now known to more people than he ever could have imagined. But it was a double-edged sword. While the outpouring of support was overwhelming, so was the criticism. Some people who still refused to see the systemic nature of the problem twisted his story to fit their own narratives. But Mark had grown numb to it. He couldn't let the noise distract him. He had to stay focused on the bigger picture. Internally, though, things were shifting. The fear he had felt in the days following his wrongful arrest, when he wasn't sure how far this fight would go or whether it was worth the personal toll, began to fade. It was replaced by something stronger, a deep sense of purpose. Mark and Sarah had continued their routine as much as they could. He made time for his kids, for their school activities, for the moments of normalcy they still had, even as everything else seemed to be in a constant state of flux. The courtroom battles loomed, but they didn't take away from the small joys of life. Sarah's unwavering support gave him a strength that no lawyer or public endorsement could. The kids were unaware of just how much their father's life had changed in the last few months, and Mark wanted to keep it that way. He wanted them to stay innocent for as long as they could, to believe in the world the way children do, without the weight of history, of oppression, bearing down on their shoulders. But there were moments, late at night, when Mark lay awake, thinking about the consequences of what he had started. Tom had been working tirelessly to ensure the officer was held accountable, and slowly but surely, things were moving in the right direction. Internal Affairs had finished their review, and the officer in question had been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. There were still questions about whether he would face criminal charges, but the department had already made it clear that they were taking the incident seriously. However, even as justice began to take shape, Mark knew that this wasn't just about one officer or one case. It was about the broader fight for justice, for equal treatment, and for a system that had, for too long, turned a blind eye to abuses of power. One evening, as Mark sat down with Sarah in their living room, a weight settled between them, something unspoken, but both of them feeling it. They had been through so much in the past few months, and while progress had been made, they both knew that change was slow, especially when it came to systems that had been entrenched for generations. Mark didn't have to say it out loud for Sarah to understand. He wasn't just fighting for justice in his case. He was fighting for a future that didn't require men like him to constantly prove their humanity. "How do you keep going?" Mark asked her one evening, his voice quieter than usual. He was sitting in the same chair where he had first received the phone call from Tom, the call that had set everything in motion. "Some days, I wonder if it's all worth it. The media, the rallies, the fights behind the scenes. I mean, it feels like no matter what happens, there will always be something else to fight for. Another person being mistreated, another wrong that needs righting. It just feels never-ending." Sarah took his hand, her grip steady, and she smiled softly. "It's never-ending because the fight itself is bigger than you, or me, or any one person. It's a fight for our children, for the generations to come. The world isn't perfect, and it won't be anytime soon, but that's why we keep going. You're not doing this alone. You've already made a difference, Mark. And even when you feel like you can't do any more, just remember, those ripples you started, they're out there, they're spreading, and they'll keep spreading." Mark looked at her, his chest tight with emotion. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "There are days when I feel like it's too much. Too many people looking at me, too many eyes watching every move I make, every word I say. I'm just tired, Sarah." She nodded, her eyes soft but firm, knowing the burden he carried. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep going. You've already shown everyone what it means to stand up, to speak out. And that's something no one can take away from you." Mark closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words settle over him. He knew she was right. This fight was bigger than him. It was bigger than the arrest, bigger than the officer who had wrongfully detained him. This was about changing a system that had been built to oppress and marginalize. It was about sending a message to his children, that they could grow up in a world where justice wasn't just a concept, but a reality. It wasn't easy, but the hardest battles were always the most important. The weeks passed, and Mark found himself returning to his normal life in small, meaningful ways. He went back to the gym, spent time with his family, and even started to take on speaking engagements, talking to local schools, community groups, and even law enforcement officers about his experience. His story had become a powerful tool for change, a tool he was using to make sure no one else had to go through what he had endured. Slowly but surely, the momentum began to build, not just for his case, but for a movement that was bigger than any one person. Then came the day that Mark had been waiting for, the day of the formal hearing. It had been scheduled weeks ago, and now it was finally time for Mark to step into that courtroom. His heart was pounding as he dressed, his mind a mix of anticipation and nerves. He knew this was the culmination of everything he had fought for. The officer would face accountability, and Mark's testimony would be a testament to the truth. He walked into the courtroom with Tom by his side, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He could see the officer across the room, standing with his lawyer, his expression unreadable. Mark had no fear anymore, not for himself, not for what was about to happen. This was his moment, his chance to make sure his story was heard, and to make sure justice was served. As he took the stand, Mark looked out at the room, at the faces of the people who had gathered to hear him speak. Some were there for the right reasons, others just curious spectators. But Mark didn't care about that. He didn't care about the people who wanted to judge him. All that mattered was this moment. When he spoke, it wasn't just his voice. It was the voice of everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. It was the voice of his children, his community, and all the people who were counting on him to make sure their stories, too, would be heard. "I'm here today," Mark began, his voice steady. "Not because I want revenge, but because I want change. I want a world where my children don't have to fear the very people who are supposed to protect them. I want a world where my skin doesn't dictate how I'm treated. And I want a world where justice doesn't depend on who you are, but on what's right." The words hung in the air. And in that moment, Mark knew that whatever happened next, he had done what he set out to do. He had fought, and he wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.